If you would like to work directly with Dr. Kole to maximize your sleep quality with a comprehensive sleep coaching program, or if you're concerned that you have sleep apnea, or simply just want a second opinion consultation, she's now available to see patients in New Jersey, New York, California, and Georgia, with more states coming soon. Please visit oak.care/sleep for a complete list of telemedicine services with transparent pricing. You deserve rapid access to quality sleep care with a physician you can trust to have your back every step of the way on your journey to better sleep.
Hi, I'm Dr. Alison Kole, sleep medicine specialist and bona fide chronic insomniac. Welcome to the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast. Remember, knowledge is empowerment, and if applied correctly, it can help you biohack your way to a better night of sleep, just like I did. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Sleep is My Waking Passion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alison Kole, and I am joined today by the CEO of the Hypersomnia Foundation. I'm very excited to present to you Ms. Claire Wylds-Wright. She's accomplished so much. It's crazy. So I wanted to start off by really explaining to you why I decided to do this episode. On September 22nd, which is coming up, we're taping this a bit before then, is World Narcolepsy Day. And you guys had heard, if you've listened to the podcast pretty regularly, I have another episode with Dr. Kevin Trice where we really dig into what exactly narcolepsy is. And I initially brought that topic up because it's one of those sleep disorders, essentially, where you really have a lot of fragmentation of your sleep, and then that results in you feeling considerably sleepy during the day. However, what I realized in doing that and in speaking with Claire on some other topics was that central disorders of hypersomnolence, basically issues with your brain that cause you to feel too tired, these are disorders that are pretty rare, but they're equally as debilitating as something that's very common, like insomnia or difficulty sleeping. So my obvious personal journey was more about having difficulty falling asleep, maintaining sleep, whereas folks who have central disorders of hypersomnia are actually too tired despite how much sleep they get. In fact, some folks even sleep a long time and they just feel so tired they can't even participate in life. Again, extremely debilitating. And while this may not apply to some folks who have difficulty sleeping per se, I would encourage you to listen and learn as I speak with Claire about the importance of this very significant topic. So in introducing Claire, I'm going to say she is an author. She wrote a book called Waking Mathilda. It is now re-released. It's an amazing book, and it's about her journey into this world. She is a trained physical therapist. She's originally from England, and her daughter essentially developed a condition that I mentioned to you, narcolepsy, when she was only 3 years old. She's the youngest, or was at the time the youngest person to be diagnosed with narcolepsy.
Yeah.
Share with us. Tell us about this story.
Thank you for having me, Alison. Such a pleasure to have this time with you. Yes, you're right, actually. Matilda was 3 years old back in 2010 when she developed symptoms of type 1 narcolepsy. So that's narcolepsy with cataplexy at the age of 3. So you're right to mention her being the youngest diagnosed, but I would add to that at the time, because now she's 17.
Wow.
So time flies. So yes, it was a very abrupt onset, which is pretty typical with pediatrics in narcolepsy. So it was very, very dramatic. Very complicated to get a diagnosis, of course, at that age, and even more complicated to get both expert care and medication that she needed. But I'm happy to say that 13, 14 years later, she's a little bit of an expert. She doesn't remember life without it. I do. So, you know, I have a role here, obviously, as a patient advocate, a caregiver, as well as representing the Hypersomnia Foundation, Sleep Consortium, and, as you said, as an author. So
So you are really beyond just, a trained physical therapist. You're really scratching the surface of what you do to advocate not only for patients, but to advocate for the entire disease space. So I'm not done talking about you is the bottom line. So, so Claire started off and she actually was there are a couple of big organizations, Hypersomnia Foundation being one of them. And Claire actually started getting her feet wet in terms of advocacy with working for a well-known organization called Wake Up Narcolepsy. So she was initially the executive director over there, and then she moved over and now she is the CEO of the Hypersomnia Foundation. And I wanted the Hypersomnia Foundation, and Claire, please feel free to chime in. My understanding from reviewing everything you've done, from our conversations, from looking at the website, you can go to hypersomniafoundation.org. Not hard to find, and I encourage you guys to check it out. Really is multi-pronged. You have information for patients, you have information for caregivers, you have information for clinicians who are interested in learning more about these disorders of hypersomnia. And you also have links to what the latest research is doing. And today we're going to focus on talking about how you can be the best advocate for yourself when you talk to a sleep provider. Anything else with that? I think that's a nice summary, but please feel free to add.
I think you've covered most of it there. I mean, the website is a great resource, and it's particularly detailed for patients in terms of resources, as well as current events, programs, and areas of support. So it's both current, there's a lot of kind of past information on there with educational content such as videos and podcasts, but also lots and lots of research, as you said, about advocacy, self-advocacy, and not just for the patient, but for supporters as well. So go over and check it out. It's www.hypersomniafoundation.org.
Furthermore, you are now the co-founder of the Sleep Consortium, which is a really interesting program. So tell everyone about what you guys are doing for rare diseases.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Sleep Consortium is a 501c3, so it's a not-for-profit organisation that exists to accelerate research and drug development for patients. So it is quite unique in the sense that we're not a patient advocacy organisation per se. Our role is to bring together various stakeholders, KOLs, and also patient-reported data, large and small data sets from academic institutions or registries, and integrate them onto a platform that leverages artificial intelligence and machine learning. But here's how it's unique. The platform, which is hosted by another 501c3 called RareX, which is now RareX and Global Genes, has many disease spaces, mostly rare, that are already integrated onto this technical platform. And Sleep Consortium is bringing sleep data, as it were, both from the patient perspective, medical records, as I said, and data sets, and will integrate that data with other disease areas. So this is pretty significant because it's not been done before, in the sense that as sleep is brought onto the platform, it will help identify new patients. As you said, Alison, there's lots of people with sleep disorders, and many of them don't know they've got a sleep disorder. So, for example, you could go into the platform as a pediatric person with epilepsy, say, or you could be the parent that puts the data in, and you could list through the sleep survey and domains sleep symptoms, and you will automatically be sent an email to identify the fact you need to go a step further, hopefully leading to a diagnosis, a secondary diagnosis in most cases. So it's pretty unique. It's been a heavy lift, I think, in terms of educating the community, even some of our partners, industry partners, but I'm really happy to say that we're hoping to launch the patient portal early 2024.
This is really exciting. I just wanted to clarify, you folks. Claire is talking about not only patient data, but when she mentions the word KOL, that's really a reference in sort of industry parlance for key opinion leaders. And these are folks that really help to shape where research is going. They may be researchers themselves. They may be clinicians in academic settings who who are very familiar and comfortable with management of relatively rare diseases. I can say from my perspective, as small as a multi-specialty private practice with 1,000 physicians compared to multiple thousands of physicians practicing can be, I had my fair share of folks that we were able to come to a determination that they had either narcolepsy or idiopathic hypersomnia. And what I didn't realize, but since my transition out of that model, is that not too many of us really feel comfortable with it. I've had patients even reach out to me who, say that their new physician may not be comfortable with some of the medications or treatments for what they have because it's just a lack of familiarity. And really the goal here is to get folks who may suspect there's something going on with their sleep because they're too tired, and also folks that treat this to get more comfortable with it, because once you get comfortable, it's just like another skill set. And the impact for sleep disorders like narcolepsy and idiopathic hypersomnia, I mean, as you mentioned, just your daughter's 17 now. So we're looking at 14-ish years since she was diagnosed, and mind blown with the treatment options. I'm over a decade out of fellowship at this point. Treatment options different. So there's been a lot of things moving in the right direction for folks like this, but you can't really get people on therapy and improve their quality of life if you have no idea what you're doing or how to get there, right? You need the roadmap. And
Right.
And fortunately, folks like you are actually really taking the time to try to accelerate that. So kudos to you. The other thing too, guys, is, and this was something that was sponsored, but Claire was the host of a podcast called Narcolepsy 360. So if you look at that, you will hear all sorts of stories from folks who have run the gamut and were willing to share their stories. Are there any other highlights from Narcolepsy 360 that you might recommend people check out?
Well, I think, the actual title of it is probably self-explanatory, because I really wanted to give a full perspective on the disorder. So a lot of the interviewees are actually patients or supporters as well as clinicians and researchers. So there's quite a large bank of content to access, and you can pretty much pick what you're interested in, I think.
Awesome. Okay, so guys, I wanted to briefly just clarify what we're talking about again, just so that you understand the jargon that we're going to. But I will tell you right now, Claire's going to offer advocacy tips. They may be more specific to the sleep world, but I think they're just teaching points for any disease space. And that's why I was so excited to speak with her. So the two disorders that are probably the biggest but rarer disorders out there are narcolepsy, which tends to be more prevalent than idiopathic hypersomnia. But just to give you a scheme, if you think about what I have focused the podcast on things like difficulty sleeping, chronic insomnia, you're looking at, at least 10% of the population having complaint of that. And if you're looking more broadly at just sleep difficulties in general, it's probably closer to a third of the population, at least in the United States. If you're looking at data for obstructive sleep apnea, globally, the latest data in 2019 suggested that about 1 billion people have some form of sleep apnea, okay, in the world. And in the United States alone, it's estimated that maybe up to a quarter of the entire population has sleep apnea. So common, translation common. If we look at the narcolepsy data, you could be looking on the order of 25 to 50 people per 100,000. So it's considerably less common, though we do think it's probably underdiagnosed just because it is a rare disease and you have to know what to look for and what signs to be sort of curious about. If you're looking at idiopathic hypersomnia, which we're going to get into, that name sounds really like, ooh, that's fancy. What's that? Basically, it means we have no idea what caused it. And that's even probably what you'd say about 60% of the prevalence of narcolepsy. So it's even rarer, we think, than narcolepsy. Though I would argue in my clinical practice, I think I saw more IH than I did narcolepsy. I do think that that would be a fair assessment based on my past decade of experience. And again, maybe I'm just skewed with the patient population because I've been a pulmonary critical care, but fellowship trained person. And I've noticed a theme of people tending to find the neurology sleep person when they get that diagnosis. So, at least from what I can see, though, I have a few friends that are pulm crits like me, and we really enjoy this talking about this disease space. So just in terms of things that we talk about in narcolepsy, again, check out my episode with Kevin Trice because we really get into the weeds. But generally speaking, you're getting theoretically a sufficient amount of sleep, right? You're getting the hours of sleep. But there's a lot of what I've referred to as sleep fragmentation or disrupted nighttime sleep. There's little disruptions during the night. And you feel incredibly intensely sleepy and unrefreshed. You may feel okay initially when you first wake up, but then that deep, intense fatigue sets in and you feel like you just got to close your eyes. Some people actually have what we call sleep attacks where they just can't help it. They must go to sleep. People will often describe sleep paralysis. I'm not going to define that for you guys, and I'll tell you why. Anybody can have sleep paralysis. Typically, it's intermittent, and when you've had it, you know it. So that's all I'm going to say about it. It's one of those things I've universally never had to tell a patient about because when they have it, they go, oh, I know what that is because it's freaky. And then, Claire had mentioned what her daughter had, which is the type 1 narcolepsy. Not everybody has this cataplexy, but it's really sort of to an intense, typically it's triggered by something like an intense emotional reaction where, a part of your body may become weak. Claire, would you mind sharing with us kind of what cataplexy looked like for your daughter at 3?
Yeah, of course. So you're right to point out, Alison, that usually there's an emotional trigger of some sort, and that can vary actually between different people. But we didn't know it at the time. What we saw was a child that kept collapsing, like a full body collapse at various moments. And usually when she was about to do something she liked. So once we had a diagnosis and a full understanding of type 1 narcolepsy, we understood that Mathilda's trigger for cataplexy, whether that's a sagging of the jaw or head bobbing, knee buckling is really common, or in her case, a full body collapse where she's conscious but unable to move for a few seconds. Her trigger was happiness. So that's very common. It's not the only trigger. Could be surprise, could be anger. But in Mathilda's case, what this meant was effectively that whenever she was happy, she developed cataplexy. And as a 3-year-old and your brother and sister wanting to play a lot of really cool games with you, that pretty much happened hundreds of times a day. And it obviously can pose quite a serious physical risk, whether you're a child or an adult. And does translate, if you can imagine, into adulthood where, you would still want to experience joy. And unless you're on really effective medication, that's a pretty hard symptom to deal with. And oftentimes what happens is people will avoid the trigger to avoid the symptom. And in Mathilda's case, that was, if I'm never happy, I'll never have cataplexy. So, we've seen that manifest in all sorts of ways, like avoiding particular happy situations or friendships or jokes. Other times when she's safe, and I should add, she's really well medicated right now. So we only really see cataplexy in the evenings. Usually she's home and she does fully participate in joyful activities because she's safe at home, and it doesn't matter. If she's on the couch watching a show or something, she's quite safe. But the psychological impact is really difficult to measure and shouldn't be underestimated.
Oh, that is such a key point. I can't even, it's one of those things it's all over the media now with everybody being unhappy, stressed, all the other things, trying to get through a pandemic. And yet here we are, sort of sitting here talking about how do we find joy. A lot of the things I talk about are wellness and how we can find joyfulness in what we try to do. And yet there's a disease process where literally it's almost that psychological training of like, oh, I don't want to feel joy. It's going to make me feel worse in the long run. I can only imagine, guys, read her book, because I can only imagine how challenging it has been and how profound an impact medical therapy has been in returning her to, a good quality of life.
Yeah, I think without medication, it would be very, very difficult even to leave the house, actually. And that's certainly what we experienced prior to Matilda receiving treatment. We were housebound, not just because of the cataplexy, but because of excessive daytime sleepiness. So at any time you could turn around. I remember once telling all the children to go get in the car, and I sort of stepped outside to follow them, and she was asleep in the driveway. So the symptoms can be very severe. And if not managed effectively, they are extremely impacting on all aspects of one's life. And of course, it's a 24-hour condition. So we've talked a lot about daytime symptoms, but nighttime symptoms are also very intrusive, very disruptive. We could even go into hypnagogic, hypnopompic hallucinations, because that also brings a psychological toll as well.
So by hypnagogic, we're talking about around the time that you're trying to fall asleep. When it's hypnopompic, when you're about to wake up, where, really what's happening in narcolepsy is there is a lack of a neurotransmitter or a neuropeptide called orexin in the wake centers of the brain. And the orexin is really important for sort of stabilizing wakefulness. And it's also important for regulating when a stage of sleep called rapid eye movement sleep occurs. And rapid eye movement sleep we all go into, it's supposed to be at night, typically after we've already had our lighter stages of non-rapid eye movement sleep, and maybe we've even gone into deep sleep, and then we have a rapid eye movement period. We dream a lot during that time, and we cycle in and out of it. That's the natural part. What's interesting about rapid eye movement sleep is our bodies are physically paralyzed while our minds, our brain activity is quite active. And the problem in narcolepsy is because you don't have that orexin to stabilize those relationships, you are having folks and literally have REM sleep intrude into their wakefulness. So that paralysis, that cataplexy, that weakening that's occurring is really, REM sleep is not supposed to be there. That's only supposed to happen at night during certain periods of time. And you don't have that pathway there that you need. And in Matilda's case, what's very curious is that it was something that was, you guys were living in England at the time? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so was it the Pandrex, the European vaccine that she received for H1N1 at that time?
Right. It was the Pandemrix, the 2910 H1N1 vaccine. That was very specific to the UK and Europe, but it wasn't the same vaccine. Just for your audience, as reassurance, it was not the same vaccine that was distributed in the US.
Right.
So what happened in 2010 is that there was this sudden rise throughout children in Europe, particularly certain countries like Finland and Norway, UK, where, typically no pediatrician, neurologist or otherwise sees a really young child with narcolepsy. So all this was kind of happening pretty quickly. And Matilda was actually picked up in the end at Stanford here, California, because of course they had their fingers on the pulse and were identifying this surge of cases. My understanding, Alison, is that there's about 1,800 children in Europe that developed type 1 narcolepsy on the back of the Pandemrix vaccine, and Matilda was the youngest of those. So every one of those children and families have got a unique kind of journey towards diagnosis. Typically, that was very difficult, and even more so to get treatment post-diagnosis, and then of course navigating life with this incurable disease.
Yes, and I what I want to emphasize is it's one of those things where this is where science is not perfect, and what's meant to help can sometimes harm, but in no way, and I want to state that for the record, am I someone who does not support vaccination. I think it's really important for folks to get vaccines, appropriately so. But nothing is perfect, and we try to help and not harm, and sometimes we can harm, under the best of circumstances. But please, this is not, and I do not want this podcast to be ammunition for people who are against vaccines and all of this. But it is an interesting correlation. My reading about it was that they're not quite sure why, but there was a thought that there's an orexin 2 receptor, and that there was some cross-reactivity with a specific type of the one of the influenza proteins, and that caused probably some sort of an immunologic reaction, or at least it's postulated to be that. So I don't know if you know of more data regarding that, but that's sort of what I was able to uncover. Does that sound about right?
Yes. I think, yeah, absolutely. And sort of it's in the public domain. I think that the vaccine was what we call adjuvanted. So it's just a fancy word for saying that it had like a boost, sort of an array of chemicals, products in it to boost the efficacy of the vaccine. Because, of course, to be fair to governments and biopharm companies, they needed a vaccine very quickly that they could distribute on a huge scale. So that drug development was accelerated. In an ideal world, as you say, that wouldn't have happened. Of course, wasn't tested on children. And like any vaccine in that kind of context, there's quite often fallout. I wish it wasn't our family story, but we are certainly not the only ones who were affected by it. And it's unfortunate. It's happened with other vaccines right across the history of science. So unfortunately, it did affect a lot of children and adults, actually.
And there may really be in part a genetic predisposition to this. We do have, genes that code for certain proteins that are important for our immune system. Human leukocyte antigen, that's a system that we have of genes that kind of code for this. And certain people just have different genes, right? We're all genetically different. And one of the postulations is that they're seeing associations with a particular type of what we call an HLA haplotype, essentially. And, for folks who have that haplotype, they just may be more at risk for having an immune reaction where you're responding to something else. Maybe it's a vaccine, maybe it's a virus, maybe it's a bacteria. And somehow in how your body fights this off, it also starts attacking different parts. It's like an autoimmune sort of reaction. At least that's one of the hypotheses out there. So just so you're aware, it's not that everybody gets that, but.
Yeah, I'll just clarify that. Yeah. It's a really good point because the backdrop to this, of course, was that we eventually found out Mathilda did have the HLA, the biomarker for narcolepsy, and this is quite common. In fact, my other two children also carry it, and yet you need a trigger to then sort of kickstart this sort of hyperimmune response and develop something like narcolepsy. So Mathilda carried what we call the genetic biomarker for it. Of course, we didn't know that at the time. And there are plenty of other people, for the most part, that have developed narcolepsy and either not known what their trigger is, because as an autoimmune disease, you're right to point out you need the biomarker and you need an environmental trigger. But for other people, it was strep, other folk I've heard, it was just traditional flu that's triggered it. And certainly my older two children have had all sorts of normal bugs over the years, and as a mum, knowing they carry the gene for narcolepsy, I'm like, my heart skips a beat every time they get flu, but they haven't got it. So for the most part, I would say that Mathilda's story, although she's not alone, it is unusual, and people shouldn't be too terrified of what we're talking about here.
Thank you for that clarification. Yes, this is meant as education, but please understand, we're not trying to be inflammatory or scare folks. We're talking about some rare disease stuff, but some stuff that actually, nonetheless, if we can actually get to the point of a diagnosis, if anybody's out there thinking, hey, I kind of relate to what these people are saying, think about getting that worked up, because there are some seriously amazing treatments, as Matilda's story reflects. I just wanted to quickly touch base on idiopathic hypersomnia. As one of what I love about the Hypersomnia Foundation is it's not just we talk about this one disease state. It's really kind of, again, the central disorders of hypersomnia. And one of the other biggies is this idiopathic hypersomnia. Again, as I mentioned, it's basically, hey, we don't really know what causes this. We're not really sure. There is conjecture that we have this gamma aminobutyric acid, or GABA, and we have these receptors, and a lot of things affect those receptors. And there's a thought that there's some sort of an enhanced activity of these receptors, and it's really responsible for sort of inhibiting some of the activity, the activity of our nervous system. So in other words, kind of makes us tired. So we're not quite sure if that's the key. That's something that's been looked at. Again, the prevalence is much lower. One of the things to distinguish the two is, yes, you have profound sleepiness, but my understanding from speaking with other folks that treat a lot of this, and also my own clinical, experience, is that folks often have what we call sleep inertia. It's like you literally can't open your eyes. It's crazy how tired these people are, especially in the morning, and it's so difficult to get them to move. But it's in the context of definitely sufficiency. We're talking 8 solid hours, and they're not having complaints of waking up a lot. They're like sort of dead to the world for those 8+ hours. And I say plus because many times people may actually be sleeping 9 or 10 hours, and they still feel this way. And you can imagine how debilitating being that tired during the day can be. So you guys are really trying to highlight the importance of all of these disorders of hypersomnolence, of being too tired during the day.
Right. And also I think it's the important distinction here, because, sleep disorders is really difficult because we all know what it's like to feel tired. But the distinction is that if you are having excessive daytime sleepiness during the day, and you're right to point out that people with IH have extended sleep periods at night, they also need naps in the day. And one of the distinctions, apart from sleep inertia, is that they're not rested after a nap. Whereas with Matilda, if she takes if Matilda takes a nap, she's generally a bit recharged, which is quite typical of narcolepsy. But with people with idiopathic hypersomnia, that's not the case. So they have this grueling exhaustion. And again, it's not how we experience sleepiness. And there is an analogy, actually, I don't know if you've heard it or talked about it before, Alison, but to sort of understand, as someone who doesn't have a sleep disorder, what it's like for someone who does. There's an analogy around, it's kind of like if we weren't to sleep for about 72 hours, that is what it feels like for people with IH and narcolepsy every day. And then during their wakeful times, they're supposed to be productive, go to school, college, hold down a job, run their domestic lives, relationships. So their effective hours in the day are so significantly shortened. And even during that time, they don't feel as awake or refreshed as we do, even though they've had more sleep. And the difficulty in diagnosing, there's two things. One of them is I don't think medical students are given enough time in terms of education during their training in sleep disorders. That's a big problem. It's ongoing. I think it's beginning to shift a little bit, but not as much as we would like. And also because we all experience sleepiness, we don't necessarily equate excessive sleepiness with it being a disorder. And that's where we sort of all need to get educated, because it is a disorder. It's very distinct from normal tiredness, and yet we can find a million excuses. I mean, I did that with Matilda, even as a clinician. I was like, oh, she's got a cold, or something's going on, that's not, my head didn't go to sleep disorder at all. It went in all sorts of directions, as it did with her neurologist. So I think to be educated about the difference between normal sleepiness, excessive tiredness, and actually clinically being tired is really important. You can take that kind of information to your doctor, your sleep specialist if you're fortunate enough to have one. Make sure you record. You can keep a sleep journal, for example. I used video, actually. Video was the tool which actually secured a diagnosis. Even though Matilda
Wow.
had been in hospital under observation on and off for about 5 months, it was actually videos, two things, well, three. One of them was a cataplexy, which we talked about, was very striking to video a child with cataplexy. Another one was her wakefulness during the night and having hypnopompic hallucinations. And the third thing was just video imagery of like her asleep. And I remember one where I was pushing the Hoover around. She was just asleep on the couch. And even that wouldn't wake her. So I think to build kind of a profile, a record for yourselves where you're either writing it down, keeping a sleep journal, just like people keep a food journal. But also if you can get some things on video, that will probably accelerate your diagnostic journey, hopefully.
That is such a great tool. So now we get to the real fun part, which is what is highlighted on the Hypersomnia Foundation website and what Claire is alluding to, which is how do you advocate for yourself and what are the things that you really want to kind of keep track of? So Claire, you're pointing some of them out. Number one, you need to get yourself educated because sometimes you need to also educate the clinician in the right direction and they can only go by some of the information. So having a diary of those symptoms, and I love the video diary of it because that's real, especially for sleep disorders like narcolepsy. That's so profound that you could actually, witness it. And it's something that is often like how, it's difficult to describe narcolepsy. It's difficult to even ask about it. Even as a clinician, even when you have experience or sort of knowledge and you've seen it. You also, on the website, they talk about, making decisions, how to negotiate, and some of the other important aspects of social support. And you had shared with me a bunch. So I'm going to let you take it away. Tell us more. Tell us more about what we need to do.
Okay. I would also take someone with you if we're just going to talk about going to a doctor's appointment, you need your records, your own personal records, and it could be video, but it could also be photos. Pictures just tell 1,000 words, don't they? So take all your information. I would take someone with you as well, because when you're asleep, you're not aware of what else is going on, maybe even how long you've been asleep for. So it's always good to have someone, and even sometimes in the appointment, we can get so sort of emotionally distracted that we're not going to communicate these really important aspects of our lives. And of course, in any doctor's appointment, it's quite right that they're asking about symptoms. So there's a bit of a checklist with these sleep disorders that you'll hear, but I would encourage you to also talk about impact. So we could talk about excessive daytime sleeping, how many naps you take a day, what that feels like, whether or not you have some other key symptoms, as Alison pointed out about disturbed nighttime sleeping. But ask yourself this: how does it affect you? How does it affect your relationships? How does it affect you in the home, at work, at school, during recreation, your mood? Because one thing we haven't touched on is the many comorbidities, what we call comorbidities, that are associated with sleep disorders. And some of those are very profound effects on our mental health. And really put it all out there. So when you go to the doctor's office, have it all written down, just in case you get derailed a little bit and say, actually, wait a minute, I am sleepy, I do have these symptoms, but the net result is I can't drive. Or it's affected my marriage, or whatever, my job. I need to nap at work and I've got nowhere to do that and I don't know how to talk to my employer. So write down and report every way in which your life is impacted, as well as the typical kind of symptoms.
You also mentioned in your email to me about spoon theory. Talk to me about this.
Oh, yeah. I love spoon theory. Oh, I wish I'd written it actually. It's not new, and I can't remember the lady's last name. I think her first name's Christina, but if you Google spoon theory Christina, I should know more than that because I've been using it forever. So it's like a code of language, and it's a tool that can be used in any disease space when you are trying to explain to people your capacity. And so, for example, really quickly, I think imagine that you've got 8 spoons in any given day, and each spoon represents a certain amount of time or energy. And so Matilda will wake up in the morning and use 1 spoon to go and get breakfast and use the bathroom, down to 7, and then another 2 spoons because she's got dressed and started school. But then she'll take a nap and get a spoon back. So it's really important because it's a really lovely visual way to explain to people, this is what I'm working with. You know, she could go out in an evening and maybe she's only got 3 spoons, and it's a real problem if wherever we're going, it's running late, someone's running late, because I know then she's down to 2. It's also quite a nice like private code where sometimes there's a lot of shame around being sleepy, and falling asleep outside or somewhere in public is really tough, even in college or school, and at work, of course. So when I try to talk to her and we're in a group and I can see she's tired and she doesn't want to sort of go off and find a bench in the park or something like that, she'll say, I got 1 spoon left. And I know that means we need to find somewhere to sleep. So it's a really useful tool to measure yourself, what you can and can't do, and also demonstrate to others your capacity. And again, right across different disease spaces, there's more to it than that. Google is our friend at this point, I think.
Yeah. Well, I that's such a great tool for communicating amongst your family, amongst friends. It's like a code. It's a very easy code, and I think people can really relate to that, which is awesome. And then you had one more, and you said to me, finally, use your gift. More on this, smiley face. What is that? We're going to end with that because that sounds cool. I want to know.
Oh, that's funny. Okay, so I think with all these things, with being the patient, caregiver, loved one, that it's actually when you develop something like a sleep disorder or any other disease, there's quite often grief. And that grief journey is very well known and documented, isn't it? I think there are 6 stages. It starts with denial, and then there's anger, then there's you eventually get to acceptance, and so on and so forth. Well, the last stage, and I think this is also published now, is finding meaning. And this is where, because we've all got gifts and talents, and what I've really enjoyed seeing in our community is people who not necessarily have got to the end of that grieving process, but during their journey have actually leaned into some things they're good at, and actually then shared that talent and that gift with the community, with people in their lives, and in that sense sort of made meaning. Now, doesn't have to be writing a book, could be anything, could be artwork, could be being an advocate on social media, which is just very, very impactful in a good way, very positive. Any kind of gift, talent, and we all have them, and there is an opportunity there to kind of lean into that, where you can say, okay, this was really a short straw, this was a hard hand that I was dealt, but maybe there's good that's come out of it. And for my part, I think I'd never have met so many incredible people who are so resilient and wanting to do so much good for the community in this space, that it's been really humbling. Now, I think I still wish Matilda didn't have narcolepsy, but 14 years in, I can honestly say that there's been many benefits to it, and that's due to other people, I think, sharing what they can with those who need to hear or see or experience it. So do your thing, do your thing.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That is so profound.
You're doing your thing, right? This is a great example.
Trying. Yeah.
Trying.
It's finding you said a very powerful word, which is resilience. And we have it in us, but part of that resilience comes from a shift in our mindset. And, you know, what natural talents do we have? You know, what can we control? We can control a lot more than we think we can. You know, I think a lot of times we sort of go, well, it's just the way it is, and I don't know what to do about it, and so I'm just going to sit here. And sometimes just putting, you know, forward momentum. And sometimes that means I just put one foot in front of the other today. That's what I got done.
Right. And I don't mean to make it sound easy, because I think that journey requires a lot of self-care. And that could be, you know, therapy. Of course, you need good medical care. We've talked about that. But there's lots of other ways as well to get the support you need, and find the tools that you need to have in your toolbox to basically reframe your life and move towards thriving. So it's not that easy necessarily to wake up and say, oh, I'm going to do a podcast or write a book or something like that. It's a journey, but it's one that's well worth pursuing.
100%. Bravo. So well said. Claire, I know you have to run. I am most grateful for this opportunity to chat with you. It's been enlightening. It's been inspiring. Keep doing what you're doing, because, you know, even now, some of the clinical trials that are en route to being completed and underway are really, really fascinating. There are new treatment options that are going to be coming down the pike that, at least my little ears tell me when I've been poking in and researching what's happening. So it's a very, very exciting time to be part of this community. No, I am not happy that a disease like narcolepsy or a disease like idiopathic hypersomnia exists, just like I'm not happy that we all have challenges with sleeping. But can we overcome these challenges and move beyond them? The answer is yes. And your foundation is a classic example of that. Your work with the Sleep Consortium is also an example of that. So let's keep the forward momentum and the positive attitude and that resilience.
Yeah. Thank you, Alison. Thank you for having me.
If you are enjoying this podcast, if you feel that you are growing, you're more knowledgeable, you're feeling empowered about your sleep, that is the purpose. So please, please take the time to like and review the podcast, share it amongst your friends and family. Please follow me. If you'd like to follow me on Instagram or Facebook, I am there as well. My handle on Instagram and TikTok is AskTheSleepMD. And you can also go to my website, AskTheSleepMD.com, for more information about each of these episodes. We will be sharing with you cited articles that you can actually refer to and read yourself if you like, and lots of juicy tidbits about how to sleep better. Thank you. This podcast would not be possible without the support of Mr. Joey Salvia, who is my producer, and Adrian Pederath, my creative director. Disclaimer. The statements made on this podcast have not been evaluated by the U.S. Food or Drug Administration. They are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent disease. The information provided by this podcast should not be used as individual medical advice. While I am a practicing sleep provider, I am not your sleep provider. You should always consult with your personal healthcare provider for individual recommendations and treatment.